All right, so good morning, everyone. My name is Donald Long. I'm an NCASM Cohort 5 Fellow at Howard University, working under Dr. Terry Adams Fuller. And the title of my talk is "A Storm is Brewing, Risk Perceptions and Decision-Making Among Emergency Managers." So just a quick overview. I'm going to talk about the background and rationale for this project, go through my research questions. I'll talk about my research design and sample, then also my references and acknowledgements. So just to give a quick background on emergency managers. So emergency managers, they serve as a crucial link between the public and forecasters. They have a pretty diverse role, but a lot of what they do is centered around fostering preparedness and resilience in the community. And because their role is kind of so multifaceted, they have to operate in a high stress environment. So if you see there in the bottom left, that's actually the Chicago Office of Emergency Management. And I chose that picture because I had done some work and kind of understanding what the Office of Emergency Management there goes through back when I was a pathway student working with NWS Chicago during a severe weather outbreak during, I think it was Pride, kind of collaborating with them on that. So continuing here, so there's been some work done by NCASM researchers to investigate emergency management and kind of get a feel for what or how they make decisions. Preliminary findings suggest emergency management lacks standardization, which I'll kind of talk about a little bit later on. EMs do rely on their own knowledge and perceived risk based on previous experiences. So a lot of them are, especially the more experienced ones, they'll tend to rely on their previous experiences dealing with certain weather situations. There's also a high variance in education and experience amongst emergency managers. So you have emergency managers who are maybe more experienced. At the same time, you have emergency managers who may actually have gotten a bachelor's or a master's in emergency management or something related to that field. And so that's kind of the demographic we're working at. So for the rationale, so previous studies have modeled communication pipelines and forecasting tool usage. So looking at, well, what tools are emergency managers using? So things like radar, mesoscale discussions, or area forecast discussions, kind of some of those products that some of us may be familiar with. But what's been shown is that risk perception can affect emergency manager judgment, which of course is going to impact decision making. So the idea is to illuminate information on how they make decisions, strengthening that communication pipeline, hopefully saving lives. And so EM decision making, of course, again, has a direct impact on the public. And so to define risk perception, so that we're kind of on the same page about what that actually means. So we're guided by Coleman 1993, their assumption that it's defined as a multifaceted cognitive assessment of one's likelihood of coming to harm. So how likely am I to be hurt by this storm? So for the research questions for my project here, so we're really trying to look at what factors affect emergency manager risk perception. And I've basically been able to kind of divide them into two different kind of categories. So meteorological and non-meteorological. So the meteorological factors would be things like the hazard itself, whether it's a tornado, severe thunderstorm, lightning, kind of like some of the previous speakers. Timing is going to be very crucial to emergency managers. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then also an accurate interpretation of forecast information and products. So things are becoming more probabilistic. That's great for kind of seeing, maybe where things are more likely to happen or what's more likely to happen, but it also kind of incites discussion. And when there's more discussion, you could argue that there may be more kind of confusion, for lack of a better word, about what's actually going to happen. And then also the non-meteorological factors. So emergency managers are, of course, thinking about personal liability. If I evacuate this event if I evacuate the Super Bowl because there's a storm coming, am I going to get in trouble for that? Is there going to be fiscal responsibility associated with that? It's going to come back on me. So that's kind of another consideration there. So for the design of this project, so it's going to be a qualitative analysis performed using two displaced real-time severe weather events. including group interviews, multiple choice survey questions, and then respondents were asked how they would, basically actually how they would respond during an actual event in real time. And so so basically this project is using data from the spring 2019 iteration of the hazardous weather test bed experiment that was conducted in NSSL. And so there were some previous NCATs and researchers who went out and actually collected data, interviewed some emergency managers that had been participating. The two events, so the events were selected by NSSL. But the research team for this project chose these two events to look at, specifically because they were kind of later in the participant exposure in the test bed, and then also some of the other things that they're doing in the test bed. They're of course being exposed to operational and research products. And then participants were also exposed to the severe weather events for 90 minutes. They were unaware of the date specific to each case, but were aware of the location of interest. And so this is kind of an example of some of the materials that they were provided during the actual, or right before the actual event, the simulation event. And so you see here, they're provided things like SPC outlooks, a forecast discussion, convective outlooks, things like that. And then, so for the sample itself, so between looking at just those the 2 weeks of this test bed, so interviews and surveys were conducted with 8 emergency managers at the hazardous weather test bed after their simulation. The EMs were city and state level officials, so we're not looking at federal emergency managers here, we're just looking at state and city level. Participants were provided a variety of forecast products, kind of like I've mentioned, just things typical to what they would have during a typical real life scenario. And then participants were assigned roles during the scenario, so similar to what they would have in real life, where maybe one emergency manager would take one portion of the county or things like that. And so some preliminary results for this. So this is an ongoing project for my thesis, which will conclude at the end of fall of this year. But some preliminary things. So emergency management lacks standardization. There's not really a CONUS-wide kind of set of book of rules for emergency managers to follow. There's of course some guidelines, and there's also things like NEMS courses and things like that that are offered at the federal level. But in terms of day-to-day boots on the ground work, it's kind of like they're going based off of their experiences. And that gets into how they rely on heuristics, which heuristics is basically, it's simplifying a complex cognitive process. So if you can imagine, they have all these inputs, all these variables that they're considering. So they have to simplify that in order to actually get a decision made. And so, and then also time being a critical factor. Of course, time and distance are related. So, considering how fast a weather event is moving towards a particular, let's say a stadium or something like that, they have to consider how fast it's moving, again, the hazard itself, and also how much time they would have to evacuate the number of people. And also considering things like how much, space there actually is to maybe bring people from an outdoor event to an indoor event, things like that. So that's kind of what they're considered. So a few limitations of this project. So again, emergency management practices vary across the nation that might impact generalizability. So trying to use this to apply it to other areas or other parts of the country, because these events and this test bed are local to central Oklahoma. And then also, of course, our sample size of 8 emergency managers is small. And then for future work, I added this part here, basically saying that because emergency management is dominated by white males, there may be unforeseen downstream effects on BIPOC communities, because just thinking about just kind of thinking about the question, like what might they be missing in terms of addressing the needs of specific communities. We think about the lower Ninth Ward with Hurricane Katrina and how some of those communities were kind of the last to evacuate. A lot of them didn't come home. Thinking about other areas, and we don't know, we want to kind of know why, and we want to address any disparities that may be happening because of kind of this information overload that emergency managers are faced with. So these are my references here and acknowledgements here. Right. And with that, are there any questions?
Okay. Well, it was very good with time, so we have time for 2 questions. Yes.
Yeah, so you focused on standardization and said how basically emergency management lacks that across the country. Based on how in different countries, they may face different types of severe weather events based on just like the topical area of where they are. Do you think standardization is necessary for emergency management?
I don't know if I would say that it's maybe necessary, but I think maybe having a more centralized set of guidelines and practices, especially when it comes to, and this may be personal bias here, but things considering around BIPOC communities and things like that, because it's such a vulnerable community. I think other communities or other speakers have kind of expressed that there's a particular need there that may not be being addressed.
Thank you.
So it's crazy because I'm actually working on a project similar to this now. But I was curious what you think you're going to end up seeing from your survey.
So from the transcripts and from the survey, I think that they're going to express basically, of course, timing is important. You know, the hazard, I think that it's going to vary a lot depending on the actual hazard, because it's kind of a different consideration when you think about like a wind event versus, you know, lightning or things like that. So I also think like I really would like to so I'm going to be doing my NERSO at NSSL this summer, but I don't know if I'll have the opportunity to maybe talk a whole lot about this particular project that I want to. But it would be interesting to kind of get at some of the non-meteorological factors too that are affecting how they make decisions, and particularly, you know, maybe stresses from the job and things like that may not show up or may not be being considered elsewhere.
Okay.
Thank you.
Actually, we still have time. We can take, yes.
So how did you select your sample?
So this sample was actually pre-selected by NSSL. They're participants in the hazard loading test bed.
Okay. Very good. We would have had one more, but I don't see that person. So maybe we can take another 5 minutes and see if anybody has questions for the previous speakers. And I have a question for you.
Yes.
So the question I have for you is, there are so many groups. Thank you very much, Donald.